Hi everybody, my name is Bougie, and I would like to welcome you to Teach Only Love. Teach Only Love is the name I have given to my spiritual practice, to this initiative I have going to bring forward spiritual material in a format and in such a way that it hopefully touches you, inspires you, pulls you in to explore more about yourself. This video is the first in what will be a series of spiritual discussions, and in this first series of Teach Only Love, what I'll be focusing on is a book called The Way of Mastery, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. So what I'm going to share throughout this first video in that series is a little bit more about my spiritual background, an introduction about where this material comes from. Then we'll go through in the book the introduction and the promise from Jesus. Prior to that, I'll be talking about who the video is intended for, what my teaching philosophy is, information on my spiritual background, because I think it's important that you have an understanding of where I'm coming from, that you know what paradigm I came out of and have come out of, where my influences have been. I think that's only fair when someone is bringing forward spiritual material to share with their listeners, with their students, however you want to phrase that, something about their background. And as I go through, my approach is going to be reading from the book and then commenting as I feel inspired to do or led to do by Spirit on different passages, bringing in my own experience, pulling in other material as is relevant to help in understanding, to help in cross-referencing with related material that you might be familiar with or might not be familiar with now, but may want to delve into and explore further. So this video is really intended for anyone on the spiritual path who is interested in expanding their own spiritual evolution, in fueling it, in coming to a greater awakening of who and what they are. And I will be throughout pointing to that awakening. So it's really for anyone on the spiritual path, no matter where you are. If you feel drawn to this video, if you're interested in this material, then it's for you, bottom line. My teaching philosophy. So what is my approach? I see myself as a teacher, but within that, or as part of that, especially with this material, I don't consider it as much teaching as pointing. I have a teaching background. I have a bachelor's in education and history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I taught middle and high school students early in my career. I have done a lot of corporate training and that kind of work in the IT environment, which is the field that I happen to work in. But that's less relevant. That just gives you a little bit of information about why I'm calling it teaching. But it's really more of a pointing, as I was saying, and it's really more of a helping you remember what you already know deep down in your soul, in your spirit, because ultimately we don't really have anything to learn. We are complete and whole just as we are, but that has been, let's just say for now that has been forgotten, and it's time that we remember it. And why do you think they call it awakening? Because you're waking up to the truth that you already know is there. And when you wake up is when you realize that, wow, it's been here the whole time. So the other reason that I'm bringing forth these videos is because I need to learn this material. I need to remember this material. I need to keep it alive in my own life and keep it vibrant. Because as I'm going through life, this has become my primary focus, is my spiritual path and in expanding that awareness. So this is one way that I do that. When we want love, we need to teach love. And teaching means to demonstrate. So really, as a pointer, as a demonstrator, as someone helping you remember, me bringing forward and trying to give love out to the world gives it to me first. Because if you think about it, when you offer love to someone else, whether it's reciprocated in a way that you find pleasing, or whether it falls on deaf ears and isn't even noticed, and every other reaction in between, no matter what, if you're sending, feeling, expressing, extending true love with a capital T, divine love from your heart, then who gets to feel it first? You do. You do. So in my teaching, I'll be referring to my notes here when you see me look this way. In my teaching, I'll be referencing other related material. This will be material about similar paths that that have the same content, but come in different forms. And ultimately, when we're talking about any true teaching, and eventually, as we go, I'll get more into what I mean when I use the word true, because I realize we all have relative truths in our own lives. We say, well, this is true for me, and that's true for me. And ultimately, while I acknowledge that's part of our experience, those are not necessarily the ultimate truth, the absolute truth, the truth of the divine, infinite expression. So, that being said, the other thing I was going to get into with that is content and form, and let's just, to level set right away, let's acknowledge that the same types of truth, the same types of information can come to us or to everyone in many different forms and lead to the same place. Many different paths can be used to go up the same mountain. Many different roads can be used to get to a destination within a city. So we don't all have to take the same path, but the essence of where we're headed and the information contained therein is similar, or could even say the same, not maybe identical, but the same in terms of what it's trying to express. This would probably be a good place for me to mention right up front that I'm going to be talking about a lot of things, a lot of different things, probably different perspectives than you've heard before. But I like the guidelines from A Course in Miracles that it uses in its introduction to the workbook. And what it says there is, you need remember only this. You do not need to believe the ideas. You do not need to accept them. You do not even need to welcome them. Some of them you may actively resist. Some of them you will find quite startling. None of this will matter or decrease their efficacy. Some of the ideas you will find hard to believe. This does not matter. You are merely asked to apply the ideas as you are directed to do. You are not asked to judge them at all. You are only asked to use them. It is their use that will give them meaning to you and will show you that they are true. So, with that as a background, I'm not ever expecting you to take me at my word. I'm trying to point you toward being able to have an experience on your own, where you don't have to rely on other people, other masters, other teachers to tell you what is true. I'm pointing you toward the way taken by Jesus of Nazareth, also known as, he gives his name in this material as Jeshua ben Joseph. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But going back to my teaching philosophy, I'll be using material that's related. I already referenced one of them, A Course in Miracles. A Course of Love is another very relevant work in this area. There's elements of the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Buddhist sutras, mythology, the esoteric tradition, astrology, numerology, anything that will help provide an alternative and supporting idea to what I'm talking about. When a person is putting themselves into the framework of being a teacher, of being a leader in a sense, it's important that they use a lot of different methods to try to reach their students, especially in a broad context like this, where I can't know each and every one of you and what your learning style is, what your background is, but you always try to meet your students where they are and speak their language. That's what the wise teacher does. So you could consider all of this a form of satsang, which is a word, it's one of the Indian languages it comes out of. It's not Sanskrit, apparently. Did a little research on this, but it's one of the Indian languages. And Sat is a root word, S-A-T, in Sanskrit, even though this is not a Sanskrit word. That means essentially the divine essence, the divine name. No, not the divine name, sorry. The divine essence, universal oneness, that kind of thing. And so satsang is a term used for spiritual community, for fellowship, often done in the context of a leader doing talks throughout that. So, but it's really the emphasis is on a joining and a community forming around that. And that's what I envision this becoming. And I like to use words from different traditions, again, just to relate with different people and their background and just give a different flavor to the context to what we're doing. So really, I come forth to teach only love in the way that I have remembered it. I will be teaching material, at least in the way of mastery, and A Course in Miracles and A Course of Love. These are books I have read. These are books I have read for years, that I've studied, that I am intimately familiar with, that I have personal experience with on many different levels and many different expansions of awareness within those. So, but there's a prayer I like from A Course in Miracles that I'm going to share with you right now that is the essence of what I'm doing here. And it goes like this. I am here only to be truly helpful. I am here to represent Him who sent me. I don't have to know what to say or what to do, because He who sent me will direct me. I am content to be wherever He wishes, knowing He goes there with me. I will be healed as I allow Him to teach me to heal. And that's the end of the prayer. And that's straightforward and simple enough. And finally, the last point I want to make, excuse me one moment as I check my notes. Two more points, sorry. One is that the format of the class, I might have said this, if I did, I apologize. I've reshot the beginning of this video multiple times, and so I don't have an exact memory of what I said in this video or what I said 20 minutes ago when I was shooting the one I ended up not going with. But anyway, the format's going to be me reading from the book and then expressing, commenting as we go through on different passages, on different sentences, on different ideas and thoughts as I feel guided to by Spirit. It's going to be a sort of me reading and then coming forth with the stream of consciousness that I feel inspired to bring forward as part of that teaching. I'll share my own experiences as well. And then finally, I recognize that in order to be a master, and this material is called The Way of Mastery, so in order to be a master, one must forever remain a master student. And so that is the approach I bring in and the spirit in which I do this. So my spiritual background, it's wide, it's varied. I've got influences from a lot of different traditions. I've tried a lot of different things, not even just spirituality. Well, let me just go through my list here. I've tried agnosticism. I've had dips into atheism. very brief, but I've explored it. I had times in my life when I was like that. I went through a strong period of intellectualism in my 20s where I kind of was deep into Western philosophy and Greek and Roman philosophers and very focused on the mental aspect. I was raised Roman Catholic. I haven't been a practicing Catholic for many, many years. I considered myself to have left the church and left that behind, although it is part of my tradition, and I honor that. I have great respect for it. I don't know that a person has to give that up to be on a spiritual path of awakening. It can come in so many different forms. I can't speak for other people. I just know for me, that didn't work, primarily because the view of Jesus as espoused by the church is very, very different than the one provided in the Way of Mastery. And the one in the Way of Mastery resonates more clearly with me. When I considered myself to have left the church in my 20s, I took Jesus with me. It was not a problem for me to have Jesus in my life. I loved Jesus. I felt a personal relationship with him. But I thought that the images and the vision and the description I was being given of him and his mission and his meaning in our lives was not correct. And so I sought out for a different perspective on that. At the height of my intellectual days, I became a skeptic, questioning everything and needing everything to be proved to me. And it was just a period I went through, and I got over it as I grew out of it. I've studied Buddhism, Hinduism. I've been part of 12-step groups. I'm very familiar with that tradition. A Course in Miracles, as I mentioned, A Course of Love, and just a brief comment on A Course in Miracles before I continue. When I first was exposed to that, and the reason I bring that up so much in the context of A Way of Mastery is because in the context of A Way of Mastery, the Way of Mastery, Jesus or Jeshua references A Course in Miracles, references having been the source of that material. And whether you believe that or not is irrelevant, and we'll talk about channeling in a minute. But point is that when I first was exposed to it, there was an eerie familiarity with it. And for me, at first, it was eerie. It was a book that I was compelled to read. I felt extremely drawn to. I was fascinated by it. But the more I got into it, and this is going back about 10, 11 years ago now, 12 years ago, the more afraid of it I became. And I went through, I think, about 7 years of having to pick it up, go through it for a little while, put it down. I think I bought and gave away 3 different copies before I got the copy I have now, because I had this love-hate relationship with it. It was like it's like when you have one of those bad romantic relationships where you're drawn to the person, but then when you get together, it's good for a little while, and then you have all this conflict. That's how I felt about A Course in Miracles. Not so anymore, but that was my first experience. And as I look back now, I realize the reason I struggled so at first is I did not have a correct interpretation of the ideas. So they startled me, they scared me. I also think that my ego was very threatened by it, as of course it would be. And maybe at that time I was too attached to the ego to be willing to start to give up the idea of being separate. So talk a little bit here about what I meant before when I talked about the context and the form being, how they relate together. And there's really, I guess I already mentioned, there's really one truth, and then we each have relative truth as well. But by the one truth, what I'm talking about is the truth of non-dualism, the truth of non-separation from God, and all that entails. And my view of non-dualism, my view of unity, is that it's put forth in one of the Hindu traditions. I'm not sure which. There's so many different ones. I can't come off with the name of the group right now or the name of the school of thought that posits this, but that we are all one. We are not separate from our Creator. Yet within that, there is this unique expression that goes on where there are differentiated forms of consciousness. And you and I being examples of differentiated forms of consciousness. And that goes on all the while that you're unified with Source. And I think there are also, along the path, different degrees of revelation and awakening to that unity. And I think one can go to the ultimate level of being completely one with God, where differentiated consciousness completely disappears. But then there are these, it's as if it's on a continuum now, so then there are these different degrees of manifestation. That isn't even the right word, because that implies something different. There are different degrees of consciousness that are still part of the one consciousness expressing itself as differentiated. And to alleviate any fears that unity consciousness, oneness, means a disappearance of me, no, it doesn't mean a disappearance of your consciousness. It does mean letting go of your personal identity as the personality, as the ego self. It means letting go of the idea of being separate. But it does not mean that we disappear into some sort of vast nothingness, or that we become this sort of sucked into this Borg-like entity and become this amorphous blob without an individual consciousness or expression. So that's another point to be aware of, that we're of, about where I'm coming from. In the way of mastery, Jesus says, the dream of separation occurs within a space of mind that is nowhere, which holds no value and no purpose. Now that's from the third book in the volume called The Way of Knowing, and I'll get more into that in a minute. But the important part is that quote, that he's refuting separation there, giving a nice description of what it really is. It's an incorrect perception that can be corrected at any point. It doesn't require years and years of study. It doesn't require hours and hours of meditation. What it requires, it may require some removal of some blockages first. And another way of saying that is purification. But don't let that word scare you. It's not as if you become lily white and can't swear or drink or party anymore. It's just more the idea of purifying, is just this idea of removing anything in yourself that blocks you from your awareness as a being, a divine being. So the way of mastery does come forth from Jesus, and I'm going to talk about channeling in a minute. And in terms of just talking a little bit more about what is meant by different paths, all leading to one truth, is A Course in Miracles says that a universal theology is impossible, but a universal experience is not only possible, but necessary. So what that implies, what that means, is that we're never all going to agree on the theology involved. But we can all agree that we're headed towards a common experience, and it's that experience that reveals to you the truth of it. In the end, there is only an experience that will convince you. And it is that I will be trying to evoke and provoke within you, as it has been provoked and evoked within me from my teachers. A true experience that you can have yourself. So just to be aware, I'll be using terms out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, because that's the tradition this book comes out of. So there'll be terms like God, Father, Holy Spirit, Abba, Mother, etc. And if you find some resistance arising in yourself to a particular term, then a couple things to note. One is that simply substitute a term that works for you. Maybe you like the term higher power better than God, or maybe you prefer divine consciousness, or the infinite one, or any number of other names. There's Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, Brahman, emptiness, infinity, creator, source, universe, father, mother, and there's many different figures you can point to and utilize: Jesus, Sophia, Krishna, Buddha, Muhammad, Mary. So again, different forms pointing to the same content. Also realize that where you encounter resistance to particular terms, anytime you're feeling resistance to anything, it's one, because you have the incorrect interpretation of what that word means. So you're threatened by it, because none of these words or terms are meant to threaten you. Two, it may mean that you have past conditioning that needs to be overcome. Many of us come out of traditions where certain words trigger us because of the effect they had on us when we were younger. But as a person progresses on the spiritual path, it's important that at some point you reach a place of neutrality with all these different terms, and you recognize that if I'm really going to consider myself or be a master, an advanced student, an awakened being, I can't be letting myself get triggered by certain words. That needs to be worked through and as such, overcome. And that often happens naturally. It's just a part of awakening. But in order to get to where that awakening is able to continue to come forth, might require you working in whatever way you feel you need to overcome the use of certain terms. And in the meantime, if you're feeling resistance about that, just substitute a different word. Or consider the fact that maybe this path isn't for you. It's not for everyone. I'm not trying to reach everybody. I'm trying to reach those people that are interested. It's sort of like they say in the 12-step groups that one of their traditions are the framework they use for guiding their group behavior and their relationship to outside entities in the public. And they talk about how they base themselves on attraction and not promotion. In other words, they don't go out and seek to convert people. They're there for anyone who wants them. And that's the way I view myself in this material as well. So let's talk now a little bit about channeling. This is channel material, the Way of Mastery. The way it came forth was, there was a man named John Mark Hammer. He's still a man, he's still alive, as of the recording of this video, as far as I know. And that was his name when he channeled this material originally. He has since changed his name to JM, Jayem. It's kind of a play on the first two initials of his birth name, John Mark, JM. So he channeled this material between 1994 and 1997. What became the chapters in the book, which are called lessons. Chapter 1 is lesson 1, chapter 2 is lesson 2, etc. Each of those came about a month apart over a 3-year period. And we wind up with 35 total lessons, 35 total chapters. And he did this in front of a live audience. Those channelings were recorded and are available on CD, in MP3 format, probably on tape still if you want to, if you're still using tapes. I can't imagine you are, but point being, you can obtain those, and I purchased them. For me, they were well worth the purchase, because you get to really hear the voice inflections, the intonations, the sense of humor comes through a little more clearly, and it just enriches the material. But whether you buy them or not, just know that that's how this material came forth. So in regard to channeling, when I whenever it was that I first heard of the term channeling, originally I was skeptic. I thought, well, how can that be? How is that even possible? That sounds weird. It sounds far out. Sounds bizarre. But then I did allow myself to set that aside long enough to at least look at the material. So, okay, regardless of whether this person claims to be channeling or not, does the material speak to me? Does the material, the content of what they're, again, this is contented form, right? Does the content that they're bringing forth resonate with me? Is it something I can relate to? Is it something that draws me in? Is it something that rings true? My approach then was that be open, be curious, and if it has meaning for you, then it's speaking to you. And then I had to consider the fact that how many other great works of literature would have come forth in a form that we now would call channeling. Think about the Bible. I mean, that's the first and most obvious example, or any great spiritual work, ancient ones especially. Think about Shakespeare, the Iliad, the Odyssey. I mean, all these great works of literature that we revere. We know in many cases who wrote it, or at least who claimed to write it, but we don't know exactly how they received the material. So also then along with that, in terms of channeling, the way to think about it is that most of us recognize that there's and Carl Jung put this forth, as far as I know, he put it forth under this name that many of us are familiar with today, the collective consciousness. And in the collective consciousness, all consciousness is joined, and it's accessible and available to anyone. And if all consciousness is joined, and as part of the paradigm of this, of what we're studying, we would necessarily need to acknowledge that there are other dimensions where consciousness operates and doesn't have bodies, or at least isn't available at a frequency that we can see. So as far as we know, they don't have bodies, but that consciousness still exists. When someone dies, their consciousness lives on and is still, because we also operate from consciousness, available to us. And as such, we can kind of connect in with that frequency and avail ourselves of any material of any thoughts, any statements, etc., that might want to come through. So whatever your thoughts are on channeling, try not to let that prejudice you against or preclude you from at least hearing the message. There's a 19th century English philosopher named Herbert Spencer who has this, what I think is just a great quote that kind of encapsulates all of what I'm saying here about channeling. Quote, "There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation." End of quote. So what do I need from you? What else do you need to know before we start? Recognize that if you want to move forward on this path, but you're finding some resistance, that a little bit of willingness is all you need. Just a little bit of willingness is all you need to move forth on this path. And think about why you're here. Why are we here? Us joining in this common purpose, and anyone joining in the common purpose of seeing your own innocence, or seeing the innocence of those around you, seeing the divinity of yourself and the divinity of others, seeing the Christ nature, the Buddha nature of all beings. Any two joined like that are joined in what A Course in Miracles described. This comes from A Course in Miracles, this little definition describes it as a holy relationship. And when we're engaged in holy relationship, the Course says that we save 100 years for every minute we spend that way, which is pretty phenomenal. So, all of that said, that's my introduction, and let's get now into. Well, I want to tell you first. You may wonder why do I have headphones on like this? And it's simply because I like to listen to music when I do this kind of work. But I completed 2 of these videos, uploaded them, but because they had copyrighted music in the background, YouTube wouldn't allow me to broadcast it. So that's why I have these. So the way of mastery. So let's talk a little bit about the way of mastery and get into it finally. This is the book I'm talking about. It's what it looks like. It's about this thick. There's the back of it. This book contains within it what was originally 3 different books titled The Way of the Heart, The Way of Transformation, and The Way of Knowing. That constitutes the 35 chapters in this volume. Also, as part of the Way of Mastery kind of block of material, are 2 publications. One is called the Jeshua Letters, which is an account. It's written more in a personal narrative account from JM about his experience, his first experiences with Jeshua, with how the channeling came to be, how that whole communication with Jesus started. And then the last book is called The Way of the Servant, which I read parts of, but I have not read the whole thing myself yet. And the Jeshua Letters, the first book, that describes JM's experience coming to be aware that he was being guided to channel. I've read parts of that. I own it. I haven't read it cover to cover yet, but I've read most of it. So you'll hear me using at different times the word Jesus, or the name Jesus, and the name Jeshua. And I may even say Yeshua from time to time because I've seen it spelled and pronounced that way as well. The name is irrelevant. You'll know who I'm pointing to, and you use whatever word is comfortable for you. But I will say that in this material, as Jesus comes forth in this material, one of the first pieces of information he gives is that his true name when he was on earth is Jeshua ben Joseph, which I believe essentially means Jeshua, son of Joseph. Jesus talks about then, and I don't think it's in this book, but it was somewhere else I read information that had come forth from him explaining that the way the name was co-opted from Jeshua to Jesus was as it was translated from the original Aramaic, which is the language Jesus spoke, into Greek, that the Greeks translated it as Jesus. And when those texts then made it to the Germanic and English-speaking languages, French-speaking languages, Latin-based languages of Europe, they kept Jesus as part of it. And I recognize Greece as part of Europe as well, but I think you know what I mean, more Northern Europe and Western Europe. So let's look first then, in the Way of Mastery, at the introduction. This is on page Roman numeral 9. You hold in your hands the treasured teachings of Jeshua ben Joseph, one of the greatest masters humankind has ever known. It does have in parentheses after Jeshua ben Joseph the word Jesus. These teachings were given during the years 1994 through 97. Please do not hurry as you read through each lesson. Rather, allow each sentence to be held within the heart, each idea to fill the mind and the body with its very real frequency or vibration. For each word, the structure of each sentence, the cadence and the humor is by design. And I will echo that strongly. When I first found this material, I went through it very quickly, but I also have a very strong background in a lot of the things this book is talking about. But I went through it so quickly because I could not wait to get to the next page, the next chapter, the next piece of information because I found it so fascinating and so compelling and so provocative. But I have since gone back and read it much more slowly. And indeed, I didn't mention this when I talked about my background, but I'm currently teaching 2 different classes in the Madison, Wisconsin area, which is where I live. Sorry, there was a sound distracted me. And I apologize because I think my heater's been running this whole time, and I think that's gonna really mess up this video. Anyway, I'll just let it continue for now. I might have to reshoot this. So, take your time as you go through this. Or do as I did and go through it quickly and then come back. But anyway, my point is, I was saying I teach 2 different classes in the Madison area, one on the Way of Mastery, one on A Course in Miracles, in-person classes. These words are to be studied and savored over and over until their meaning deepens and flowers into the grace of Christ living in you and as you, allowing the ray of that light to penetrate your mind, correcting every perception you have ever held about yourself or the world. You will then find your gifts becoming formulated in new ways. You will find that you have an unseen teacher revealing to you what you are ready to learn. You'll have an unseen teacher revealing to you what you're ready to learn, your internal teacher. And your life will begin to be guided by a voice that is not your own until the voice you have called your own is no longer heard. What has been called the ego will simply dissolve, and the mind will know perfect peace. Does this take time? You are as close as the choice to teach only love. The 35 lessons contained in this volume reveal that way taught to Jeshua himself, and now lovingly presented by him for you, so that the choice for love becomes your every thought, your every breath, your every action, extended to the world as the awakened Christ. May you be transformed by the way of mastery in your unique process of remembering who you really are. So there again is a languaging of this process as being a remembering. It's an awakening, a remembering, not as much a learning. Let's go on now to page Roman numeral 11. And this is the first time that I'll be speaking words that Jeshua channeled through JM. I promise you this. If you become wholly committed to awakening from the dream you have dreamt since the stars first began to appear in the heavens, and if your one desire is to be only what God created, then lay at the altar of your heart with every breath everything you think you know, everything you think you need, and look lovingly upon every place that fear has made a home in your mind, and allow correction to come. It will come. Regardless of how you experience it, it will come. And the day and the moment will arise, and all of your pain and fear and suffering will have vanished, like a wind that pushes the foam of the wave away, revealing the clarity of the ocean beneath you. You will literally feel throughout your being that there never was a dream. Some memories might remain with you, and you will know that somewhere you must have dreamt a dream, or had a thought of wondering what it would be like to be other than the way God created you. But it will be such a faint echo that it will leave no trace upon you. I can share that I've had that experience, of looking back. You know, I feel like I've been so transformed by this material in my practice at this point that sometimes I look back on my former life and it really feels like a dream. And even this life still feels like a dream because I haven't left the dream yet, obviously. I'm still here talking to you. But I have checked out of believing that it's anything more than a dream. But more importantly, I've had that experience of wow, that what came before was nothing but a dream. And it seems like a faint echo of what I really am now. Almost like it never happened. It led me to here, where I am today, and I'm grateful for that. But let me also mention that when I say I'm obviously still in the dream, but knowing it's not a dream, that's what the Course in Miracles calls the real world. It's where we get to a level in our spiritual development where we recognize that there's no separation, where we recognize and we're really living that there's no separation, that there's no the influence of the ego as the primary motivator in life has dissolved. I'm not saying I'm ego-free. I don't know that anyone is ego-free, even the highest sage or master that we can think of in this world. But most of the time, it no longer pushes me around. I just don't believe it anymore. I don't buy what it's selling. In your heart, you will smile gently, regardless of the circumstances in which you find yourself. There will be peace from the crown of the head to the tips of the toes, and that peace will walk before you wherever you go. It will enter a room before you enter it with a body, and those who are becoming sensitive will wonder who has come into their place, and some will even say, "Behold, I believe Christ has come for dinner." And you will be that one, for that is who you are, Christ eternal, Jeshua. So that's the beginning of the Way of Mastery, and that takes us to part one, the Way of the Heart, which will begin in the next video. So I hope you've enjoyed today. I hope it's been helpful for you. We're going to get much more into the material from now on, and this is not going to be me talking about myself or my viewpoints a ton. It's going to be more about what the book says. But I needed to give you that background today so you know who you're working with here and what my approach is. And thank you for that. Thank you for joining me. I'm thrilled that you're here with me, and you're within me too, because none of us are really separate. And know that the eternal, the highest form of eternal, timeless love that I can express goes forth to all of you right now, to each of you. Though I haven't met you yet, I love you. You're my brothers and sisters, and anything I can do to help, please let me know. The contact information is in the description box. Also, there's a link to the copyright owners of the Way of Mastery. That is an organization called Shanti Christo. The Way of Mastery will get in toward the end of the book about what Shanti Christo is, so I won't talk a lot about that right now, but it is something put forth by Jesus. And I believe that the terms are both Greek, I believe. Maybe they're Latin, but I think they're Greek, and it essentially means the light of Christ. Shanti being light, and Christo being obviously Christ. Please like and or subscribe to this video, because that does help me out a lot, and eventually I would like to do nothing but full-time teaching of this type of material. Regardless, I try to bring it forth wherever I am in whatever form seems appropriate to that context. So thank you again for joining me. I look forward to being part of your lives going forward, and visiting with you next time when we begin Chapter 1, Lesson 1, in the Way of the Heart of the Way of Mastery. Thank you.